Great crisis, even as I did. And I am very, very pleased that we've had this opportunity after 25 years to renew our friendship.
Well, the same with you. We both, maybe in a little way, started on the road, gave a push along the road to solve the problem.
I believe so. Again.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. It was excellent.
And Mark, what was your main feeling at the beginning of the crisis?
Well, the crisis was a very sharp shock when it broke upon us. We learned about it as a present crisis on the day that our photographic intelligence officers decided that some pictures that had been taken by aircraft over Cuba did show that the Soviet government was constructing nuclear missile sites. We had given, we thought, the clearest possible notice. We were on record that any installation of weapons of this sort would raise very grave issues, and we didn't think that would happen, but if it did, we would have to act. So in a sense, we were confronted by a crisis created by Soviet actions intersecting with and conflicting with our own earlier words. We can come back to the question whose fault that was. At the moment, the crucial point was that your government had acted, was doing secretly something that we didn't believe it would do and had warned against. And we therefore faced a very hard question of what we should do about it. And that led to a week of extremely intense debate.
Very different views.
Very different views. There's a certain tendency for people to look to their own weapons, so that the Air Force wants to use airplanes, and the Army wants to invade, and the diplomats want to send messages. And the President is trying to make a decision, because we all know that in the American form of government, an executive decision of that sort rests with one man. So we worked on that and reached the conclusion that a purely diplomatic approach to your government would not be likely to work.
Why?
Because if we put ourselves in your government's position and we say, now, Nikita Khrushchev has done this, taken this large step secretly, he must have a large purpose. And if we go to him and say, we've found this out and it would be nice of you to take these missiles away, he will say that he's sorry that they are there for the defense of an ally, and broadly speaking, he will have, in his terms, a very strong argument. So we aren't likely to win a merely verbal argument. As one of our colleagues put it, we were confronted by a secret action of your government, and we needed a secret action of our own, which was to take a decision that we would impose a naval quarantine.
Do you believe now that there was no alternative?
I don't myself. I still not able to get in my head a picture of Khrushchev receiving our message and saying, "Oh, I didn't know you cared. We'll take them home right away." It doesn't seem to me that it would have come out that way.
Yes, and what about the John Kennedy's speech on the 23rd of October?
On the 22nd of October, he had made up his mind, and he needed to make a speech primarily to his own people, to the American people, what the situation was. I should underline, I think, Fyodor, because I find that very often friends from other countries don't fully understand it, that our decision that we really could not sit still with these missiles was based on a very deep inheritance among the American people of a belief that there should not be major armed installations of non-American powers in the United States, sometimes called the Monroe Doctrine. It very naturally doesn't strike all of our friends in other continents as reasonable. The point I make about it at the moment is simply its great strength, that this was the state of mind of the country to which JFK was responsible. And the quarantine, so-called, it's a fancy word so that it wouldn't have the legal meaning of blockade, it had the practical consequence of a blockade, was chosen as the lowest level of military response that had a chance of being successful. And then, of course, Kennedy makes his speech, and then we wait to see what your own government will do.
Did you feel that time the real dangers of
yes,
atomic war? Yes,
danger more that the conflict would intensify and that neither side would be able to control what might happen. I don't think we ever thought, I don't remember a day when anybody said, well, maybe the Soviet government wants a nuclear war. We did not think that. And I don't believe that there was ever a day when anybody said the only thing we can do about this is use nuclear weapons of our own. It wasn't in that sense a case in which somebody is going to go and press the button. It was rather a case of a direct confrontation between the two most important countries, most powerful countries in the world, over an issue that meant a great deal to each of them. Your concern for solidarity with your friends and companions and comrades in Cuba, and our concern that there not be the missiles of a non-American state, nuclear missiles especially, 90 miles from Cuba. I might say in passing that I fully understand that that isn't the easiest thing for our Soviet colleagues to understand, because they had been living with American missiles sitting in Turkey.
that's right.
And Khrushchev says in his memoirs that it would be a good thing for the Americans to know how uncomfortable this was. And aside from the crisis, I have a good deal of sympathy with that. But it leaves out this point I'm trying to make of the inherited historical belief in the United States that there was only room for one big power in the Western Hemisphere.
And whose initiative personally was to try to do the compromise with the Soviet Union?
I think that the initiative for compromise really comes first from your government. I think the most important diplomatic communication that I've ever read is the one that Khrushchev sent in a very long and quite personal letter to Kennedy, really very quickly. If you consider the crisis from the point of view of the Soviet government, it begins really with Kennedy's speech. That's on the 22nd. On the 26th, on the Friday of that week, we get a very long message, 3,000-word diplomatic message, which shows in every sentence that it is the creation of one man. We can hear him talking as we read the message. And what it says is many different things. That we have misunderstood each other, that these missiles are defensive. Perhaps I won't persuade you of that, but at the very least you can understand that we don't need a war over this, and yet we are both in a situation where we may be pulling on the ropes of war. And he sets forth clearly, but not in a way that would bind him until he can see our response, the proposal that is the basis of the eventual settlement. That he will be glad to remove his missiles if he can have assurance that there will be no American invasion of Cuba. And with a small addition relating to Turkish missiles, that is the settlement that was reached and that we have been living with ever since.
What was John Kennedy's feeling and opinion about Khrushchev?
Well, during those 2 weeks, he wasn't so sure. It was a very painful surprise to discover the secret installation of the missiles. But on the other hand, as he came to recognize what an indispensable partner each of them had been to the other, but from his point of view, Khrushchev had been for him, in a settlement which wasn't the favorite agreement of the hardliners, the tough guys in either capital, I think he came to have great respect for what Khrushchev had done. Khrushchev had misunderstood how deeply this would arouse a response in the United States, but so we made a misunderstanding. It never occurred to us that your government would do this, because we thought, of course they understand how we would feel about that. So we had not given our warnings until it was too late. We had failed, and Kennedy made this remark himself in a television conference at the end of the year. The two governments had failed to understand each other. Now that got them into a dangerous bind. And then they learned to understand each other. And Kennedy, I'm sure, would have accepted the judgment. I never heard him say it himself, but he acted as if on this premise, that his partner in finding the way out was the same partner he'd had in blundering in.
Maybe they had a wrong feeling about each other during the Vienna talks.
Well, I was at Vienna, not in the private meetings between the two men, and I have always been resistant to that argument. I've heard that argument from both American and Soviet friends, but I think that each of them came away from Vienna with a very clear sense that the other was a strong and able and determined man. I think Khrushchev may have thought Kennedy was less experienced, quite understandable, because by then Khrushchev had been in power for going on 10 years, well, 7 or 8 years, and Kennedy had been in for 6 months, and had in that time, his most notable foreign accomplishment had been the Bay of Pigs landing, which was certainly not the most brilliant diplomatic activity in American history.
Mark, did you believe that if John Kennedy was not shot at that time and Khrushchev didn't disappear from political arena, it was a real possibility?
I think it would have been a serious relationship and a constructive one. It already was.
Maybe stop the...
well, certainly get more progress faster. After all, in the time they did have, the two of them afterwards, they did reach the first serious agreement about arms testing. It was limited, but it was better than nothing. It cleaned up the air. It set an example. They established the hotline so that there wouldn't be the kind of delays in important communications that there were in the missile crisis. And each of them began to talk about the government of the other in different ways. Kennedy's speech of June 10, 1963 at American University could not have been given before the missile crisis. And there were very important changes in the way Khrushchev talked about his relations with the West in 1963. You're right, it's a missing page in history. I regret it. I think it would have been very interesting and quite possibly very constructive.
And the main lessons for today?
Don't let's misunderstand each other. On basic interests and concerns, it's absolutely essential for these two countries, more than any other two in the world, to be clear about their interests and their fears, and it doesn't pay them to try to fool each other. We do better when we are open. That's why I must tell you I have a great deal of hope from the age of glasnost.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, about your personal feeling on the beginning of the crisis. I mean, the day 22nd, when you prepared John Kennedy's press conference. And I know that you was not so good prepared before.
Well, first let me point out that even though John Kennedy found out about the existence of the missiles on the 16th of October, I was not told until the 20th, so I had only known for 2 days. And the news that these missiles had been deployed in Cuba was, for me, very, very grave problem. I mean, remember that the United States, having gone through World War I, World War II, had never been touched on its own soil. I mean, that was our mentality at that time. And here suddenly were missiles 6 minutes away from major cities in the United States. And for the Americans, it was impossible to accept in the context of how we felt during the Cold War. The morning of the 22nd of October, I was notified that the President was going to go speak to the nation. And I had to call in the American television networks and ask for time. And they said, what is he going to speak about? And I said, a subject of high national security. So they said, all right, he can have a half hour. And a few minutes later, there was a bulletin on the wire services saying President Kennedy is going to give an address on a subject of high national security. There's a funny side to this because I was a member of a poker club. And I was supposed to play poker that night with my friends. And the man who was host that night was a great American humorist named Art Buchwald. And he was supposed to buy the beer and the sandwiches for the game. And he called me right after the dispatch came out, and he said, should I buy the beer and sandwiches? And I said, Art, no, don't bother. He said, my God, it's a real crisis. But as the days went by, it became more and more tense. And for 6 days, I did not leave the White House. I had a cot put in my office. I slept there 3 hours a night. And
what about your family?
My family was at home. I didn't see them until the 27th. Saturday the 27th, we had a meeting of the ExCom in the evening. And we had no answer from Nikita Khrushchev. And it was clear that if we did not have an answer Sunday morning, we were going to have an ExCom meeting to decide what was going to be our next step. And I personally don't agree with my American colleagues that there was no consideration of an air attack or an invasion of Cuba, because I strongly remember that the meeting on Sunday morning was going to be to decide which of these things we were going to do. And at the end of the meeting, because it was a very tense meeting, President Kennedy said, now there are some of you who have not been home for a while. This is the night to go home because you may not be going home that often. And so I packed up and decided to go home and spend the night. And as I was leaving the White House, I was handed a sealed envelope. And the military man who gave it to me said, give this to your wife, because when you come back tomorrow, if we get involved in a military action, the White House will disappear. And tell your wife that if the White House disappears, she's to open that envelope, and it will tell her where to take herself and the children for safety if we are in a military confrontation with the Soviet Union.
Was it the order for everybody in White House or only for you personally?
No, no, no. It was for the key people in the White House who would have gone with the president into hiding if we had gone into a military situation with the Soviet Union.
Pierre, I know you visited Soviet Union before, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, before this crisis, and met Nikita Khrushchev on his dacha and had a very good talk and conversation. Did you believe that this man can begin a nuclear war and the nuclear force strike against the United States?
Certainly not out of the conversation I had with him. I mean, we talked for 16 hours, and we covered a wide variety of subjects. His focus, in my opinion, was much more on the problem of Berlin than anywhere else. And Cuba never came up in the discussion. Only in terms of my saying to Khrushchev that obviously the Bay of Pigs had been a dramatic mistake by the president recognized that. But there's one thing I do want to say about the meeting with Khrushchev, because it also is part of the overall misconception that is part of the Cuban Missile Crisis problem. What did Kennedy think of Khrushchev? And what did Khrushchev think of Kennedy? Well, A lot of Soviets say that Khrushchev had a view that Kennedy was not a very strong man, very intelligent, but not very strong. And some even say that that motivated him to deploy the missiles, thinking that the response of the United States would not be strong enough to cause him a problem, even if the United States found out. I personally don't share that view. I had the impression, and he talked to me about Kennedy for at least an hour. First, he said he was very impressed with Kennedy, that the meeting in Vienna, while it had not been a very positive meeting, he was sitting opposite a president who spoke for himself. He said, I remember when I saw Eisenhower, every time I asked Eisenhower a question, he would turn to one of his assistants and say, you answer for me. But not Kennedy. Kennedy would answer for himself. He was well informed, he knew the subjects. Now that was Khrushchev's view. Was he lying to me? I don't believe that. I mean, because I had really the impression that he was a very honest man, very deep-rooted in the psychology of Soviet life. I was very impressed with him.
Yeah, did you have a feeling that the Berlin problem was connected with the Cuban Missile Crisis or not?
Well,
psychologically?
Logically, even not psychologically, logically it seemed to me it was going to be tied up, that if we had done some kind of an airstrike against Cuba, that the counter-reaction would have been to move into West Berlin by the Soviet forces. I believed that at that time very, very strongly.
Yes, Pierre, now, can you compare Khrushchev and Kennedy activities and role during the Cuban Missile Crisis? We understand that they are so different people, with different political culture, different role. Повторить надо вопросы, да? The question about Khrushchev and Kennedy as personalities, Gopea, these two great figures. They were so different, different political culture, different role, history. But can you say your personal opinion about them during this crisis?
I think there are three things we haven't discussed in this conference yet that are very important. Number one, I believe that the Vienna summit was very important, that the crisis would have been more difficult if Kennedy had never met Khrushchev and Khrushchev had never met Kennedy. Point two, something that is so far relatively unknown around the world, they were engaged in heavy correspondence, private correspondence between each other. From September of 1961 to November of '63, when Kennedy died, there was an exchange of 45 private letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev. And unfortunately, the U.S. government is still not allowing us to reveal the substance of those letters. But when they are revealed, they are going to give you a totally new look at the relationship between Kennedy and Khrushchev, which again, in my opinion, contributed to the solution to the crisis. So I say that, first of all, the Cuban Missile Crisis was not a victory and it was not a defeat. It was two men who understood that if they made a mistake, the world was going to blow up around them and it was going to be a nuclear war. But the most important consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the fundamental understanding that confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was no longer possible. And if you look at various episodes that have taken place between our two countries, where we have had unfortunate relations for 2, 3, 4, 5 years without them coming back together, what happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis is stunning when you think that in less than 6 months, 7 months, we were on track towards very important reforms in U.S.-Soviet relations. Right. We had the American University speech of Kennedy, which was a milestone in trying to break down the Cold War. We had achieved the negotiation of the test ban agreement. And I've always believed that if Kennedy had lived and Khrushchev had stayed in power, and with the low level of missiles that existed at that time, that the possibility of an accord which would have brought us to equality, but at a very low scale, could have happened then, and not be in the state of discussion 25 years later.
Yes, I believe in the same. I believe that we lost maybe 25 years after this. But it's very strange that the fate of mankind belong from 2 or 3 persons. This historical joke, maybe. And then the last, your feeling after the crisis, right after the decision. Was you surprised? What was your attitude to this?
Well, I was driving to the office to attend the Sunday morning XCOM meeting when the phone in my car rang, and I was told that Khrushchev had announced the taking out of the missiles. It was a victory, not a victory over Khrushchev, but a victory over confrontation, and I felt very relieved. But I want to tell you that 72 hours after the end of the crisis, I was sitting in a restaurant in Washington talking to a high Soviet official who had come to see me to start talking about how we could normalize relations with the United States and the Soviet Union. The man's name at that time was Yuri Zhukov, and he was a close right-hand man to Nikita Khrushchev. He had come all the way to see me 72 hours after the conference to say, now, how we have solved this problem, now how do we evolve in our relationship, which shows what an important conclusion in the minds of Soviet and American leadership the Cuban Missile Crisis had.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Thank you indeed. That you was very close to General Taylor during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I would like to ask you, first of all, the question about your personal feeling when you was informed about the placing the Russian missiles in Cuba.
It was difficult for me to believe that the Russians had actually done that. There had been a lot of talk about the Soviets placing offensive weapons in Cuba, and one of my jobs was to watch things for General Taylor about U.S.-Soviet relations. A lot of other people did it also, but I did. And Khrushchev had said so many times, there are no offensive weapons in Cuba, there will be no offensive weapons in Cuba. And some of us believe that he would not want to put offensive weapons in Cuba, having made those statements so many times. And so when one found that, when I learned that they were missiles in Cuba, I said it was hard to believe. Why would someone do that? Because the president had made it very clear that if there were offensive weapons, he was going to have to act.
Did you believe that time that Khrushchev had the aim to do the first strike against the United States and begin the nuclear war, or it was some other aims in his mind?
Yeah, there are divided opinions on that. Khrushchev said at the time he did it for the defense of Cuba, and that these were defensive weapons. I think I can understand that. But the way that I personally looked at it, I looked at this as an opportunity where the Soviets were trying to make the strategic nuclear balance more even by getting weapons in position where they could strike the United States. And I can tell you that a lot of the U.S. military, not all, but a lot of people in the U.S. military services were concerned about that increased Soviet ability to strike the United States with nuclear weapons from Cuba.
Did General Taylor believe in it?
I must tell you, General Taylor believed in that less than I did. He, General Taylor, if you read his book on the uncertain trumpet, thought that a certain number of strategic nuclear weapons were enough. And I don't think it made as much difference to him as it did to some other people in the U.S. military. It made some difference, but not as much.
Yes, there are many explanations about the struggle between the military man and with the civil man.
Yes.
In income during Cuban Missile Crisis, that the General Taylor had the opinion about the first strike and maybe nuclear strike against Cuba. Is it true?
No, General Taylor would not have thought in terms of using nuclear weapons against Cuba. He knew that they would not be necessary. I mean, and I think he felt that very strongly. General Taylor thought in strategic terms but not in strategic nuclear terms. And now I'm just telling you my interpretation of what I believe he thought. We were, in terms of the conventional military forces that we had in the area, you know, we had superiority. It was much easier for us to supply troops if we were going to fight in Cuba from 90 miles away than it was for the Soviet Union to resupply its troops from, what, 5,000 miles away. And so I think he looked at, we just had a preponderance of force in that area, and therefore that preponderance of force was going to make it very difficult for the Soviets to make any decisions other than to remove those missiles in the final analysis.
But he did the proposal to bombing the Cuba. I don't remember exactly when.
Right from the beginning, the U.S. military, the senior officials, the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, believed that military force might be necessary. Now, the reason for that was that it was our belief at the time, it turns out not to have been quite accurate, that none of those missiles were operational, that none of them were in a position where they could fire. And so the U.S. military said, if we wait until those missiles become operational, then we must be prepared that if we attack them, they may launch one or more of them against the United States. And therefore the Soviets might launch a nuclear attack against the United States. And the only way to avoid that was to be sure those missiles did not become operational. And so that's why the military believed that a military airstrike had to be conducted very early.
But maybe it can be the reason for beginning the nuclear war. The stimulus.
No, you see, the way they looked at it, if there was going to be a war, the first step is taken when those missiles were put in Cuba. And so, you know, so that the first step leading towards war was putting those missiles there. And I must tell you that, again, most of the people in the United States, or most of the military, thought that if you look at the availability of nuclear weapons at that time, and you looked at the ability of who could inflict what damage, the United States had a preponderance. And therefore they were confident that the Soviets, looking at those same facts, would be very reluctant to launch a nuclear attack. And that's why they thought that an airstrike would lead to the removal of the missiles rather than leading to the next step in any sort of conflict.
General Smith, what was the reason that you prepared, I mean Pentagon, not personally, you, so many troops in Florida? Was it some preparation for intervention to the Cuba or not on some? What was the reason?
Yes, well, the reason was that the United States wanted to make it perfectly evident that we were willing to take whatever steps were necessary to have those missiles removed from Cuba. And that included the fact that the United States was prepared to invade Cuba if that became necessary. And so those troops were sent to Florida so that they would be in a position to conduct an invasion of Cuba if that were called from. And you remember yesterday, Secretary McNamara, when we were talking about it, a lot of people thought that an airstrike alone would not solve the problem and that you might have to at some point send troops into Cuba. And so the United States was really sending a signal in a way to the Soviet Union that we are prepared to do whatever is necessary to have those weapons removed from Cuba, including invading Cuba with United States forces.
You mean some demonstration?
Well, it was more than a demonstration, but it was a demonstration. You know, the President Kennedy called up some reserves from, you know, took them from their civilian life jobs and called them back into the military. And that's a very serious step. But he did that to show that he would take any steps necessary and get any forces ready necessary to have those missiles removed, even if that included invading Cuba.
Was it true that General Taylor was not so... Okay, stop.